Hello and welcome to Cinema Spotlight with Jake and Reuben. I'm not Reuben.
I'm not Jake.
And this week we'll be talking about a new roster of films, starting with The Amateur, starring Rami Malek, the story of a revenge thriller with a really boring guy.
Drop everything for the new horror thriller Drop, about a woman who starts receiving very sinister, unwanted airdrops.
And then, some say it's the greatest story ever told, but now in an animated form. It's The King of Kings, the life of a very famous man named Jesus Christ.
And finally, we're going to be talking about Babe, the classic 1995 film which, when I first saw it as a child, traumatised me and gave me nightmares that haunt me to this day.
Hello there! To all you creatives out there, another call out to see if you want to get interviewed by us, the charming chaps at Cinema Spotlight. Send your stuff over to cinemaspotlightjakeandreuben@gmail.com and we'd love to give it a watch and give you an interview.
And do make sure that you are following us, of course, over on YouTube and Spotify. Like, subscribe to our channel, comment on all of our videos and tell us everything that we've got wrong. We're looking forward to hearing from you. Now, first up, we are talking about the new film starring and produced by Rami Malek. It's called The Amateur. This film also stars Rachel Brosnahan and Laurence Fishburne. And it's directed by James Hawes, who you might know from his work on Doctor Who. Jake and I are, of course, huge fans, so expect many a tangent. Now, James, I went into this thinking, okay, this is probably not going to be very good, but it might be a bit of fun. And do you know what? I actually thought that was exactly what it did. This was precisely what it advertised itself as. A very familiar story about a man who loses his wife and goes on a bit of a rampage. But I thought it was pretty well executed and did what it said in the tin in a pretty satisfying way. Were you on the same page? Is this something that you're going to sink into on a Sunday evening when you've got nothing better to do, or are you avoiding this like the plague?
Well, it sort of sits in the middle. It's a bit like white bread. It has a relative comfort factor, but that comfort isn't very nutritious. Actually, no, that's a bit harsh against white bread, to be honest. This is way worse than white bread. I love white bread. You know what it feels like, this film? Because I find it hard to talk about because I think it has a very middling sort of sense about it. And I always find that's very difficult to talk about films that I don't have anything wildly positive or wildly negative to say. I just say, oh, fine. And well, it's directed, fine. It's edited in a typical manner. Laurence Fishburne's good, I guess. All 10 minutes he shows up on screen. I think it's just very, very stock, but it's slightly elevated amongst that sort of typical action schlock that you see on Amazon Prime or shifted onto Netflix or Tubi or one of the other ones. It's got a bit more sense about it, but you know what it feels like? It feels like when all those old movie stars who used to be in great dramas and have won their Oscars are getting a bit too old and they're like, what am I going to do now? Oh yes, I'll pivot to become an action star. Yet this is Rami Malek, who's relatively young, just won the Oscar a few years ago, and he wants to be an action star. He produced this. When I saw that in the opening credits, I was like, oh, it actually shifted my opinion of the whole movie, that I actually felt more negative about it because I was like, what is Rami Malek doing? He's so miscast in this part. And I'm like, he's supposed to be that type of person, too slender, like not very muscular, very quiet, very introverted. But also Rami Malek has, in this film especially, has the emotional range of a brick. It's no spoiler, really. I'm sure they give this away in the trailer. And this trope of films do it all the time. But his wife gets killed and he goes to seek revenge. But he's just, when he hears the news, he doesn't really react. But I never believe the conceit. He doesn't react what I'd consider quite emotional. He reacts very subdued in a way that some people might just see as subtlety. I just see as it doesn't exist. It isn't there. I don't really believe that he ever loved his wife. They only have a few scenes together that just show them being a bit quirky together. You don't really get a sense of loss, a sense of that this character, that Rachel Brosnahan, who is going to be the new Lois Lane, and I'm very excited for that, but she has nothing to do in the film. She gets fridged, and then she's, just nothing else. We're just told that they're in love and they have a little scene in the beginning, and then she gets killed and he works for a secret agency. It's just, and it's very grey. Everything's very grey. And if I go back to my favorite film of all time, a Minecraft movie, that film at least had color. I was just really like, God, I miss James Bond. Where is the sense of fun? Revenge thrillers, even though they rely on this big emotional crux, this big emotional disaster happening for our main character, are usually quite entertaining and usually quite fun to watch because you want to see him destroy the bad guys. And yes, there's some interesting moments in this, the way he goes about his kills, because he doesn't want to get his hands dirty, so that it's always slightly removed from the actual act of killing. But he does become almost an assassin. Well, he does become an assassin, what am I saying? It doesn't have the emotional weight for me to believe it, and it doesn't have the charm to get away with some of its more goofy elements. So I wasn't a huge fan, but I think you are right, Reuben, that you could just stick it on. It's one of those things you can enjoy a slice of Warburton's white bread toast and just watch it and forget it a day later, because it just doesn't have much to resonate. I don't know why Rami Malek really wanted to produce this film, if not as a almost vanity piece to try and make him a cool action-packed thriller who's more intelligent than anyone else in the room. It feels like he's trying to relive his Mr. Robot days. And so, I don't really rate it, really. I think it was a bit bland.
Yeah, I mean, I personally thought this was decently paced. I like the performances. I think Rami Malek has more range than maybe you're giving him credit for. And what I thought was interesting about this film, having gone into it knowing, okay, it's an adaptation of a kind of an 80s book, very much playing in the same wheelhouse as Jason Bourne or John Wick, or as you say, kind of Liam Neeson in the Taken movies or several other films he's also done. We're very familiar with the formula of these things. And I actually love some of those films. What sometimes troubles me, and a good example of this is Nobody, the, I think, 2020 film, is often I think that they can feed a very toxic view of masculinity and the role of men in society. Because particularly if you look at Nobody, that's a film about a man who is aging, a man who perhaps feels like he's lost his value in society, even though, he has a lovely family, a really good relationship with his wife. And what happens in that film is that basically the way that he gets his life back on track and becomes, in the film's view, kind of like a valuable member of society, is he goes on a big revenge mission, which involves him doing a lot of damage to kind of awful, young, cocky men that he beats along the way. For me, what was interesting about this film is actually it didn't go down that path. Rami Malek is not a particularly masculine guy in this film. The character that he's playing is in many ways not your average US action hero. It's not a film that reinforces the sort of macho myth of US masculinity and kind of testosterone-fueled punch-ups. Instead, what we get is this kind of very, in many ways, quite effeminate, very sensitive individual who actually, over the course of the film, doesn't become a kind of big adrenaline junkie US Marine type whose purpose he realizes is to be a big, strong man who punches people and protects his wife because that's what men do. Like, that's not the narrative that this goes into. And for that, I was grateful. I thought that made it a much more interesting story. And it gave it a bit more nuance. And it also opens up the opportunity for them to say, okay, well, if he's not going to have the physical advantage, what does he have? And so going down the route of inventive kills, I thought was really smart. We get some sort of saw trap style situations in this. I'm going to talk about the one that's in the trailer because I just think it's gosh darn fun. There's a man, it's so inefficient, by the way, as an execution method. There's a man swimming in a pool, but it's one of those big glass pools between two buildings. And he rigs a special piece of kit that we never actually get explained, which will depressurize the air between the glass so that it collapses. And that's such a fun way of doing a murder. That's so inventive. That could be in Midsummer Murders if they had the budget. It's a ludicrously overcomplicated manner of dispatching your foes, but a deeply fun one. And that was to me, the film in a nutshell is a bit overcomplicated. It's trying to do something a little bit different, but fundamentally, it's all a bit silly. And you know what? That's great. That's exactly what I wanted it to be. And I think I've mentioned on this pod before, there's a genre of films that we refer to in my family as big explosions and the good guys win. This is big explosions and the good guys win, and I'm down for that. So for me, The Amateur was a really pleasant surprise. I thought it was going to be, this tired formula, trotted out again with no new ideas and no bells and whistles. And actually, I thought it was really solidly done. There are problems with it. As you say, Laurence Fishburne barely shows up. Rachel Brosnahan, I guess maybe she was really busy filming Superman because she's just not really in this film. And she gets stuck with a very dated trope of this, oh no, the dead wife. It could be a Christopher Nolan film. In the way that she's just immediately killed in order to give this man some kind of motivation.
But with Christopher Nolan, I see that many times that the connection between those people who are killed, and yes, it's a trope that should be retired or at least developed and sort of made a bit more interesting. But I always believe that the people who have to suffer the loss of their loved one actually feel it, like I genuinely believe that those characters, maybe it's just better direction with still a similar level of nuance that is represented, or lack of nuance that is represented in The Amateur, but maybe they just get directed a nicer way because it doesn't feel like it. I don't feel like they had any connection. There's not much chemistry, but even if there was, there's not much time to show it, and I think it does really fail the film. It's not bad film, it's very amateurish in its writing.
I thought that the Rachel Brosnahan character was not so much fridged as shoved into the deep freeze as soon as the film started. And, I think that is a problem. I think that the film wants you to believe in their romance and being more emotionally invested than I think I was. However, when you have this kind of big globe-trotting story being told in a very competent manner, with some decent action, but I thought it was fairly engrossing. There were definitely moments where I was quite tense. There was one moment where I did a big gasp, which is quite impressive. So honestly, yeah, for me, I did have fun. I think if I look at this within the oeuvre of the director, James Hawes, it's not touching any of his Doctor Who work, because he's directed some of the greatest episodes of New Who and Doctor Who as a whole ever put to screen.
Well, that's a thing I was going to bring up once you started the tangent. I'm glad that you dipped your toe into the Doctor Who field first, is that I will go back to my main problem with the film. This James Hawes directed School Reunion, which is such an interesting way of dealing with abandonment and loss between characters in a different way, a much more nuanced way, when Sarah Jane Smith has to evaluate her relationship with the Doctor, someone who, to all intents and purposes, abandoned her in the mid-70s in Aberdeen, abandoned her and never went back until, 30, 40 years later. And that's dealt with really nicely. I think the director has the potential. It feels like this script has just been blacked out with any sense of like, oh, that was interesting. No, we need to meet all these beats, because you said that the traps were like Saw, whereas I do not feel that they were anywhere near as interesting. If you're not going to explain how you're going to defy the laws of architecture and physics, then at least make it a little more interesting in the other ones that he did. I think, yes, the swimming pool murder is interesting, but the others are a little unbelievable at times.
Do you know what, though? He kills so many people with that swimming pool. I really enjoy it. They've added in like an ADR, watch out, to cover up for the fact that there's a street full of people below who are definitely cut into lots of tiny pieces.
His moral journey is very warped, I believe. Because it's the typical, oh, I'm a bad person, or I want to be a bad person, but you're not a bad person on the inside. And then, yes, at the end, I am a good guy. The good guys win and there are explosions, as Reuben said. And I'm like, well, actually, this guy has committed some really massive atrocities, including treason. So I don't think he's a good guy. I think he should be in prison.
No, okay. But I actually think one of the more interesting things about this film is the way in which it engages with CIA corruption. We know, because we've seen it from a long, history of American operations in secret and black ops, that there is shadowy stuff going on underneath. And I like the way that, okay, in this, it's not really that the USA are the big, good moral center of the universe. Often in these films, as I say, there is this kind of, I think, very off-putting, often quite jingoistic sense of male American sovereignty and power and importance as the moral center of the universe. And I like that this was actually saying, okay, well, I don't think that's the case. That's not the avenue we're going to go down. So I don't know. I feel like you're not giving it as much credit as it's due. I don't think that this is just the same old thing hashed out again. And honestly, I had fun. I was entertained. And when that big swimming pool fell, I thought, many people dead. That's going to be a difficult one to explain in the paperwork. But yeah, it's fun. I think you should go and see it, dear viewers. It's decent fun. And especially if you're looking for, 2 hours to just go and switch your brain off. Like, it is switch your brain off cinema, but there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. And there's definitely a place for these kind of fun, brain-free thrillers that you'll have a broadly nice time, and you'll come out the other end and think, that was fun.
And now, when you thought it was safe to finally airdrop your photographs, no, there is evil in the electronic airwaves. We're looking at Christopher Landon's Drop, the story of a single mother who finally gets herself back out there and goes on a date, but there are malicious airdrops being sent to her phone, detailing terrible tasks that she must complete in order for her son to survive a terrible ordeal. It is a whodunit. It is filmed in one location. It's set in Chicago, but it's filmed in Ireland. This film is incredibly stupid, but some may say incredibly fun. So, Reuben, I'm going to pass it off to you, because I am sensing a vibe from you that you are in the enjoyment camp of this film.
Yeah, I thought this was really, really entertaining. I mean, I'm such a whodunit fan, and for me, this was just a sort of delicious little cocktail for me to sip on. It's got all of the elements that you would expect. Dodgy waiters, slightly sinister bar staff, a creepy man sat over there in the corner, and of course, a cute child in peril. These are staples of whodunits going all the way back to Agatha Christie and the golden age of crime fiction. And that is catnip to me. I absolutely had so much fun with this film, or at least for the first sort of 2/3 of it, because I do think it goes off the rails in the final act. The decision to film this entirely, or almost entirely, in one location, I think was very, very smart, because by having the kind of enclosure of a really, really swanky Chicago restaurant, where everyone is sort of, dressed like they've walked straight out of the 1920s, and there's a pianist getting drunk on martinis in the corner, you immediately start going, okay, I know exactly what kind of film this is going to be. I absolutely am on board with the vibes. And that basically sustained me for the first sort of hour and 10 minutes of this. It's really good fun seeing kind of first date setup that we have, which actually, is a great date in many ways, but immediately it gets completely sabotaged by these airdrops that are kind of our heroic central character starts receiving on her phone. And you know what? That's a brilliant premise. What an absolutely excellent idea for a film. Imagine if you were in a public space and you started getting threatening airdrops and you couldn't work out who was sending it, but you knew that they had to be within 50 feet of you. That's a great little setup for a film. And I think that they do a really good job of drawing out the suspense of whodunit over the course of the film. There's some really good sequences where you're trying to work out, gosh, how could she possibly get herself out of this situation? What would I do if I was in this situation? And I think it really helps, therefore, to kind of really ground you in those feelings of, oh, what on earth can she do? This is really stressful. The performances are actually really likable. I think that central duo, Meghann Fahy and Brandon Sklenar, they're giving very, very kind of charming, almost like rom-com performances. And I think that really gives the film a lift.
I think definitely they are the cornerstone. They really ground the film. They are brilliant. Because that guy, when this woman has dealt with quite a serious amount of relationship trauma, that's her backstory. She's a single mom. And this guy is the most charming, the most patient, and a very attractive man. And you can instantly understand why she would want to go on a date with this guy.
I have to say, I'd probably have left after she did the fourth or fifth insane unhinged thing of the evening. But he's the best of us, and so he sticks around. I just thought that it was fun. I love a whodunit. It tickled me in all the right ways, and I thought it was really nicely made. This begins with sort of Bond-esque opening titles with, slow motion exploding bottles of champagne.
Oh, the title sequence is the best part of the film. It's amazing. It's absolutely incredible.
Yeah, it's so good. And the score by Bear McCreary and Smoke and Shadows is, I think, pretty sensational as well. It's got that kind of, mysterious violins, but then it's also got a little bit of like fun jazziness to it, which is just... it's a delight. That's the word I would use to describe this film. It's constantly really good fun. And, even though, and no spoilers here, even though in the third act it does, I think, become much more conventional, much more generic, I just thought that it had done enough to deserve me still rooting for it and for the characters in that final act. So, yeah. Good fun, nicely made. I enjoyed the process of guessing which of the strange caricatures that were sort of populating the bar were going to crop up again and what they would be doing. I enjoyed trying to think ahead of the filmmakers. And it's got some really nice little sort of cinematic flourishes as well. It's full of crazy Dutch angles. We've got lots of kind of very atmospheric, non-diegetic lighting going on where suddenly, boom, a spotlight is just on these people over there and it's completely, unnaturalistic, but in a great way. So yeah, the swagger of this film and at times also the boldness of saying, okay, it's a one room, it's basically a locked room murder mystery. Have at it. I was impressed and I had fun.
Do you think the only reason they put that incredible title sequence in the film at all was because without it, it would have only been 80 minutes long? There's a possibility. It's a short and sweet movie. I kind of agree. I think it is fun. I guessed it immediately. I knew exactly who the villain was as soon as they showed up on screen.
That's crazy to me because I wrote off that person. I wrote them off. I thought it wouldn't be them. It's definitely not them. And it was!
And it was. It was the butler, obviously. No, of course not. There's a lot of red herrings, so you can be distracted, and they do an okay way of trying to make everyone seem like they possibly could, because everyone's a little bit unhinged, and we are looking through the main character's eyes, which does have this slightly elevated sense of paranoia, so it could be anyone, and they do establish it. There's a lot of callbacks and establishing of how things work. I don't think it's a very clever movie, but I do think it is something that you could definitely stick on late at night and eat popcorn and just have a good time with. I don't think it's bad. I think it genuinely is a good film, a very good, light film. Even though it deals with heavy topics, it doesn't really deal with them in a very intellectual or interesting way, but it does sort of define a character. There's a lot of incredibly quick emotional shifts, but there's also a lot of quick tonal shifts in this film. Throughout the majority, it is indeed a Christie-esque whodunit. Then at the third act, it just pivots into an action movie, which I enjoyed because by that point you're like, oh, we've had the big reveal, but there's quite a bit left to go of this movie, and then it suddenly pivots. And I really did quite like that extra jolt of energy.
Okay, but did you find it satisfying? Because for me, the very end of the film is a little bit unsatisfying because it does just become a sort of punch 'em up. And I did have a sense that if they had decided to resolve it perhaps in a slightly less conventional way, it maybe would have rung a bit more true. I mean, I'm not looking for realism in these things, but it felt a little bit silly. And to be honest, it felt a little bit unimaginative after the fabulous imagination of the first two-thirds.
See, I think that even though I liked it, I think the film itself is incredible, is quite underwhelming in general. I think that the premise is really good and they could have pushed it a little further by making it a little more interesting. A lot of the beats were, even the conceit, oh, we've got someone inside the house with your son, you have to do this, you have to do this. I think that the reason that the character has to do all the evil things they have to do isn't very interesting either. I think it's a little played out. And so therefore, when it did do that pivot, I was like, it'll just end now. It'll end when the extortioner is revealed and we can move on and she'll recover and all this sort of stuff. But no, it does have an extra bit of energy. And yeah, it's a bit lame and a bit unrealistic. But the whole movie sort of becomes a little better for me because it decided to push itself in a weird direction, in a slightly wackier direction that sort of does undo some of the again, I keep using this word nuance, but undoes, which I don't actually think this film's nuanced either, but undoes some of the creativity that the previous two thirds had, and then was like, screw it, we'll just do this. And I was like, well, this feels like a good schlocky film. It feels like a film that would possibly have been made between 2000 and 2009. It feels like it's in the wrong era. Hey, I don't feel like that was overly detrimental to it. I was dropped into that action quite nicely, and because I was kind of a little bored, but that's only because I love these types of things. I love whodunits. Being in that world, you can easily figure out what's going on, and it's just a nice ride. I say some negative things in this review, but I'm not negative about it. If you like this genre, you'll like this, but don't go in expecting anything miraculous. So when that action beat does come in, I'm like, I'm a bit, they wouldn't have done this on Diagnosis Murder.
For me, I think that this film and The Amateur very much sit side by side because they are both incredibly aware of what they are, the genre that they're operating in, and they're both fairly content just to sort of play by the rules, therefore, of that kind of world. And neither is The Amateur something that's massively setting out to subvert tropes. But as far as I'm concerned, the reason that those tropes are popular and the reason that they're used is because they're good. And that's what makes genre so fun. So it does what it says on the tin. Once again, it does exactly what it says on the tin. And in this case, it says on the tin, Drop, which is a title that's, I think, entirely confusing and misleading. It doesn't suggest it's a thriller. It doesn't suggest it's maybe tinged with horror. It doesn't tell you that it's to do with receiving airdrops even, because obviously they don't have the access to the word airdrop. So, confusing marketing, I would say. I think it should have been called Drop Dead, don't you think, Jake?
Yes, Reuben, I agree with you. You write to Jason Blum and you say, hey, Jason Blum, your recent film, big fan. Here's a link to this episode. And but you should have changed your name, Mr. Successful Movie Producer.
I've had a thought. Maybe the reason it's not called Drop Dead is because they're setting up a sequel called Drop Dead. That, because I think this sort of does hint at a future. I was disappointed. I don't know why, but I convinced myself as the credits were rolling that at the very end, the title of the film was going to come up and we were going to get a zzz of a mobile phone before it cut out to suggest that maybe there was more to come. And we didn't get that. Dear viewer. So maybe there won't be a sequel, but Christopher Landon, he's done sequels before with Happy Death Day. He was meant to be doing Scream, so, he exists in sequel land. And this is doing pretty well at the box office. It cost about 11 million to make. I think it's made about 11 million currently. I'm sure it will make a profit at some point in the next couple of weeks. So yeah, honestly, if there's a sequel on the way and they call it Drop Dead, I am in. I'm seated. Maybe this time they can be on a cruise ship, because I always like it when sequels go on holidays.
Or in space. That's what I want.
ISS murder mystery. That's what we want.
Yeah, there's only 4 people on this current space station. Which one of us has killed the other?
It was Katy Perry. Katy Perry did it.
Katy Perry did it. Katy Perry. That's a topical reference. Dates us. That's what we want to see.
Well, it's Easter, in case you weren't aware. And indeed, if you're watching this at a time where it isn't Easter, well, we're going to drag you back into the chocolate-filled gluttony of this holiday season. The next film on our roster is King of Kings by Song Ho Jang, who wrote and directed it. It has an unbelievably star-studded cast, and it's based on the Charles Dickens book, The Life of Jesus Christ. Now, this film, I'm told, is narrated by Dickens himself, played by Kenneth Branagh, and it tells the Easter story in a perhaps slightly unexpected way. Now, Jake, did this film make you feel reborn, or was it more akin to being crucified?
This film. Now, some may say this is the greatest story ever told, and it is a good story. I'll put it out there. Of course it is. It is the foundations of a lot of Western storytelling. The idea of rebirth, the idea of sacrifice, the Gospels, the foundation of Western ethics is very interesting, rooted in Christianity and Christ's teachings. This film is very interesting because, of course, it is based on the life of our Lord by Charles Dickens, which was a book that was kept incredibly secret. It was only made for his children and read to them every Christmas aloud. But I've done some research into Charles Dickens because I was like, this film portrays the very standard Christ life story. It's very basic if you know the means of the story. And is it done interesting? Is it done in a way that provides artistic intrigue? No, in my opinion. I don't think so. I think it's very stock. Some of the animation's okay. There's one really great bit, which I'll get into a bit later into my discussion. But other than that, it's very standard. And I was looking into the research because I was like, okay, they've used Charles Dickens as a narrator. Charles Dickens never wanted this book published. It was a very private piece of material. And then it was published, of course, after his death to capitalize on the legacy of his work by his estate, and that is their decision. But to me, I was like, this is a very personal journey. From what I haven't read the book, but from what I have researched, it is more about the teachings of Christ, or Christ as a figure who is a teacher, not necessarily leaning more towards more ecclesiastical, the more divine, really. Of course, Charles Dickens, as most people were at the time, was a very devoted follower of Christianity, but he was more Unitarian rather than Anglican, which was the dominant Christian sect in our country at the time. And this is a lot of research I've done for a kids film, which is very much basically a kids film because I had to, because I'm always concerned when you create something like a religious story for children and you put it on screens. And it has made a lot of money. I think it had a budget of maybe less than 10 million and it's made 23. It's absolutely made a lot of money. And so I am of the opinion that stories of any religion should be told because it engages a community in a greater culture or a greater cultural enrichment or a cultural debate, whatever you want to say. I think there's a lot of great stories. The sort of tales of Siddhartha Gautama, of Buddhism are brilliant. The Hindu myths are brilliant. The story of the Prophet Muhammad is one of great inspiration. And of course, the life of Christ is one that is something that you should probably learn. People who are not necessarily looking at it from a religious context can therefore extract other teachings from it. And I think it is really interesting. But when you do it for kids, you have to be very careful because it can become a very politicized thing. I don't think this film pushes it too far. I do have problems with it, though, because it's an animation. And a lot of the characters are caricatures, because animation usually is. It's an elevated style of representing the human form. So Jesus is white as snow.
A typical historical and geographically accurate representation of Christ.
He's not blonde-haired and blue-eyed, which I have seen some. I'm a musician. I was a choral scholar, so I know a lot about, through the music and interpretation. I've done my own religious studies, education, and I have a greater fascination with it, and I have religious family members. So, I'm a huge advocate, and I love engaging in the cultural lifestyle of all religions. And I think so. I know quite a bit about Christianity. And so, it's interesting that it is just this figure of Christ, this very white, very narrow, very slender, idyllic compared to all the other characters. And to me, there are a few that could skew slightly on the offensive side. Pharisees are presented as overweight, enlarged facial features, ringlets as well in their hair that could denote negative connotations to Jewish stereotyping, which is often seen a criticism of the Passion story quite regularly as well. A lot of the other characters are also portrayed like that. And these are saints, the disciples are saints, and they're portrayed in very less than glamorous ways in how they have been characterized. And so I think it does, I don't think it's attempting to be offensive, but I can understand that if you do look into it quite deeply. I thought that there were some poor choices. I thought the art style could have actually been a bit more interesting, a bit more nuance, because it does have a few moments of variation of art style. It's this sort of weird 3D animation that's okay. It's not on the par of Flow or Pixar or anything like that, but they do moments where they go through more 2D animation when they're retelling older stories, like some of the Gospels or the story of Adam and Eve. You know, they do a bit of that. And I thought you could vary it a bit more to give a better approach for kids that won't just sort of see that and get those caricatures of those stories. I think Prince of Egypt does a decent job of having a very interesting art style, having a religious story, but not feeling like it's promoting any stereotypes that have been prominent throughout history. The story itself is it is a very sanitized version of the Christ story. And I find that very interesting that they are trying to tell this story for a very young audience. You know, the main character is the son of Charles Dickens, who the story is being told to and interprets it through his own vision. So it is incredibly bloodless, quite rightly for children, but it's hard to tell that story without really leaning into the suffering of Christ. Because Christ that is the whole point of the resurrection story. It also doesn't lean very strongly into the resurrection angle. It has the crucifixion, and then it just says, and then he rose again. It doesn't really elevate the point. It's very much obsessed with the idea of showing this savior character, detailing good versus bad. The characters of Judas and Pontius Pilate are not delved into very deeply to give a better understanding of how they defeated Jesus or how they betrayed or led Jesus to his death. And, you know, I think there's not a really understanding of how the relationship with God works as well. There's only a few moments where he speaks to God. It's very rushed because they tell the entire story. And I do say it's bloodless. They do the crucifixion, but they have a very nifty way of very soft focusing all the things around him. So Jesus is on the cross, just been crucified and off screen been whipped with the 39 lashes. And he's there, but there's just this top part that can be seen in focus. So you don't see the nails in, quite incorrectly according to the Bible, they should be in his palms, but they're actually in the wrists, which is accurate to crucifixion of the time. But in the myth story, his wrists are wrapped around in rope and he is nailed through the hands. So it's inaccurate, which I should stop picking so deeply into this film, but it's done so well. It's a really interesting thing to say, is this in this modern way? Is it done effectively that I would say, oh, I'd actually like my kids to watch that because it's necessarily trying to convert people, but does it do a very accurate or interesting way of telling the story that would mean that it is for a more broad cultural discussion? I don't think it does. There is one great bit of artistry, which is following the crucifixion of Christ and his death. It has a moment where, and spoilers, but the story can't be spoiled. Everyone knows what happens.
Spoilers for a 2,000-year-old story.
2,000 years, you probably have heard some of it. But there's a moment where you sort of see a very visual and audible. It has quite interesting music, far more like anime than it is like what we consider would be a Western version of how it does the music. It's quite synthesized, and I quite liked that. I thought that was one moment that was quite nice. And so the best moment is when Jesus actually descends to hell. They don't actually say he descends to hell, but in the story after he is crucified, he descends before he rises again. And it shows it through this quite beautiful piece of filmmaking. And I thought, oh, finally, we've got something that's quite interesting. It's an actual enrichment of trying to demonstrate this story that younger audiences might actually see, sort of the idea of sacrifice in a visual way, sort of like what Flow did with how it showed its characters facing, you know, stress and climate issues, but in a completely non-verbal way. I thought that was the only moment of intrigue. I think the cast is really interesting. Kenneth Branagh does a good job narrating. He's got a very solid voice. His Shakespearean voice is really nice. That can sort of guide you through it in a very warming, fatherly way. The film opens in a really tragic scene, not tragic in the sense of the actual story of Christ, but a story of the actual filmmaking. The sound design's all over the place. I thought, oh my gosh, this film's going to be a mess. It does settle and it does become much easier to follow, but it's just all chaotic. Charles Dickens is trying to give a rendition of Christmas Carol and his son's causing trouble, and then he scolds him and then has to redeem himself by telling the boy the story of Christ to rectify his crossness with his son. So Kenneth Branagh is very good. I actually was disappointed in Oscar Isaac's performance as Christ. It's very bland. I feel like a lot of these actors were probably one-day jobs that they're like, okay, we're in this film that we've been contract for it. It's a little bit of money. Let's just deliver our voices. Oscar Isaac does voice Jesus and is very monotone. It's very, I am the Lord and I will deliver my Father into, and I think that makes it a little inaccessible to people, say, if you want a younger audience to understand who this character, who this person is, who Christ is, then I would have preferred a far more emotive performance. And you can do it with the voice. I think Oscar Isaac, can provide that. They also don't discuss the Virgin Mary or anything like that. As I said, it's like a wish. You go through it very quick, but it's also quite long because they're cramming everything in. It's an hour and 45 minutes or maybe just under 2 hours.
So who is this for? If it's quite long, but it's also kind of a bit of a basic retelling of the story, but it's also kind of who is the target audience for this? And it's interesting that you've got all of those stars in there as well. I mean, children aren't going to know, that's Mark Hamill's voice, are they? I'm so intrigued as to who the target audience for a film like this in 2025 in animated form is really.
Well, when I went to see it, I think a lot of parents were taking their children to see it. So I think they are trying to aim it for that. But I did sense that there was lots of fidgeting the further it went because they have this wraparound of Charles Dickens. Therefore, it adds more time to the runtime because you have to set up the narrator and set up the whole conflict that then leads to them having to tell the Christ story. And so therefore you're cramming in 40 years or 30, 38 years, 39 years of someone's life into a very short time span. So you don't really get an idea of who the disciples are. They deal with the miracles relatively okay. But as I said, I wish there was a bit more of a presence of who the central character was, who Christ is. And that sounds ridiculous because we all have a relatively strong understanding, especially in the UK, of what this person is or what they are portrayed as. But, I felt like you're right. I don't know who it was for. I didn't get much out of it because I'm trying to seek more artistic creativity from it. And I don't think it's as accessible to children. I think there's a much better version of this film, which was called The Miracle Maker, which is a stop-motion animation film made in the 90s, I think, starring Ray Fiennes as Christ, who gives a much more emotional performance, a voice performance. It's far more interesting in its creativity because, of course, it uses stop-motion animation, which a filmmaker can watch that and be like, or a general audience member can watch that and be like, yes, that's actually something I want to engage with to see how they tell this story in this way. It has an almost uncanny mythic quality to it that separates it, elevates it above this one, which kind of just seems like a bit of slightly less than great animation, especially now that we've had a big renaissance in different animation styles, Flow, Spider-Verse, all these great films that sort of challenge what we know are preconceived or our idea of what we want modern animation to be. You could have done something a little more interesting, like that one segment following the or just pre the resurrection. You could have done something a bit more interesting that could have engaged an audience in more to make it a little more colorful, full of life, and would have given more than just a basic retelling of the story. So I guess if you want someone to see the Easter story, this is probably a good version to take a younger audience to, but I wouldn't recommend it to anyone else unless you want to just hear the story again. I think there are better ways of engaging with this tale. And now we talk about our final film this week. It's another 30th anniversary re-release, this time Chris Noonan's Babe. Written by Chris Noonan and George Miller, the famous director and writer of the Mad Max series. Now, this film, of course, is very famous to me only because I used to see the trailer every time I put a videotape on. It wasn't a film I engaged with much as a child. The story of a, rescued piglet who then has aspirations to become a sheepdog. So it's really interesting that I didn't really have much of a connection. I have more of a connection to the second film, which I think I've seen more often, but not for a very long time. I really love the soundtrack of the second film. My favorite musician of all time, Peter Gabriel, provides his voice to a song by Randy Newman called That'll Do. That was nominated for the Oscar. And I love that song. But then again, I don't really have much of a connection to this film. And to be honest with you, viewers, just between you and me and Reuben over there, I actually think this film's a bit creepy looking back now and found it quite disturbing going back to this. However, as a vegan, woke, posh boy, did it make me more vegan? It sort of solidified some of my beliefs, and I guess that's good. I know that it had a big impact in pork sales, this film. It went down by 20% after Babe came out. It was a roaring success when it came out. So, Babe, what did you think about this film?
Thanks, Babe. Yeah, so I thought that it was really, really creepy as well. I haven't watched this since maybe 2005. I used to watch both of the Babe films on hard rotation in my real youth. And I don't know why, because they both creeped me out so much. I remember having incredibly vivid, traumatic dreams, specifically about the monkeys in the second one. And I still haven't revisited film number 2, because I think it genuinely might still give me nightmares. But I think one of the reasons why Babe upset me so much is because it is a film that basically talks about the incredibly inexplicable decision that we as humans have made, that it's okay for us to kill pigs, but dogs are out of bounds. So Babe the pig becoming a sheepdog is basically a story about Babe having to be seen as a dog in order to not be murdered. And that's crazy for a 90-minute children's film. I was astonished by how dark this is. Visually, it is quite dark at times because they're, lighting around, to be fair, like astonishing animatronics. But it is also dark in subject matter. All of these animals are just always talking about how they're going to be slaughtered at some point. There's a really horrible sequence at the very beginning in which Babe is, as happens in real life, wrenched away from his parents and they're going to go off and be killed. And that's life for a pig. So honestly, I was really shocked by this. I was kind of impressed by the fact that it was going into these kind of areas and into these moral conversations. I wasn't necessarily expecting that. And what I thought was really impressive about it is I do think that it actually manages to balance the tone quite well. I was invested in Babe becoming a sheepdog, and that's crazy. Because A, what a ludicrous story. I mean, a kind of incredible story, but it's not what you expect given how much the film is engaging with issues about animal rights, actually, and about the way in which, pigs and dogs, they have the same level of intelligence. They have the same sensibilities. They want to live just as much. And it's really striking, I think, that a film that's 30 years old was so boldly and so directly engaging with those themes. I think the animatronics are absolutely stunning.
The Jim Henson Workshop, my favorite thing ever, Jim Henson, and these great creature designs. It was the go-to. I can't believe that the workshop has sort of simmered down. I think that people should take note of all this great work that they had done. They did similarly great animatronics in a more modern film in Where the Wild Things Are. And I think that we really need a bit more of a blend between the CGI, which this film did win Best Visual Effects for, but also championing the idea of using animatronics. And yes, okay, they're often photographed in great shadow to sort of cover up maybe some of the lesser mobility of these designs, but it's just really clever filmmaking to therefore elevate something with another art form, another craft. And I think this film is a really good balance of the two. And I think that filmmakers should take note that, okay, it might be a bit more expensive or a little more troublesome, but it does have a greater result in the end.
Well, thanks for pointing that out, Babe. I think you're so right. And I also really enjoyed the performance that James Cromwell gives. Because it's strange. I think I've really only seen him as villains. And so to see him playing a guy who actually, he looks quite sinister. And of course, let's not forget, he's literally murdering the other animals on the farm all the time. So in many ways, he is the villain of the piece. But I thought that he comes around to this idea of, okay, Babe being more than just a pig. I mean, full transparency, I'm a lifelong vegetarian. I've never eaten meat. I don't believe in eating animals. But I just thought that, his kind of character arc and the way that he kind of softens towards Babe, and then the way that they become this kind of dynamic duo taking on the sheepdog contest, and Babe's a pig, but hey, we'll just put down pig as a nickname on the entrance. I just thought it was fun. There's a great bit where he does an Irish jig and it's completely random, but it's quite endearing. So honestly, I was pleasantly surprised by this film. I thought it was bolder than I remembered it being. I thought it was absolutely as creepy as I remember it being, maybe more so because there's definitely a little bit of the uncanny valley in some of those animatronics and in some of the kind of the visual effects where they're animating the mouths of the dogs. And I was also impressed by the way that it manages to weave those stories together into a really, I think, crowd-pleasing underdog sports drama, really, about a sheepdog contest. So honestly, real hats off to this film. 30 years on, I think it still looks pretty gosh darn good. Those effects I don't think have aged badly at all. And to be honest, I was a bit depressed thinking, okay, if they made this today, it would probably be entirely CG. And there is definitely a loss there. The way that they're using real animals for so much of it. They're only using the animatronics when they need to. They're only using the visual effects when they need to. I think just gives it so much of a grounding in real life. And I think it facilitates more of that emotional connection with the animals. Because you absolutely love Babe, I think. Anyway, I think you fall in love with these animals and you open your hearts to them. And it's quite moving in that respect. And what I can't believe and what I keep coming back to is just that this is a film that absolutely is pointing at the audience and saying, you are complicit in the murder of all of these animals who are as intelligent as dogs, and they absolutely want to live. And that's crazy. And I'm not surprised that this massively drove up vegetarianism. It made James Cromwell himself become a vegetarian and start talking about how it's wrong to kill animals. And I just think that's fascinating. This film is culturally and historically significant. And now I want to watch Babe 2, Pig in the City, because I have no idea where this story goes, because I can't remember it. But if it continues to sort of mine these themes and these ideas within a family-friendly context, that's fascinating.
Well, Babe, to relate it to the film I just previously talked about, I think that Babe achieves success through kindness and passing on goodwill, which is another great story. So not only does it really thrive on its veganism, which I would say and I think even James Cromwell might have even gone further than vegetarian after this film. I think he possibly turned vegan from what I remember reading, and became a really outspoken advocate. And you are right, he's incredible in this film, a really understated. It gives very few lines, as is with the character, but it's just so emotive through his own journey. It's very, very nuanced for a children's film. But I like the way that Babe achieves his success through very quiet and very charming, a pursuit of kindness and understanding. And I think that's very rooted in the Gospels, and it's rooted in this film. Really does bode well that Babe is an incredibly cute pig. And I think this, as I had a bit of a trouble with the previous film being able to connect to younger audiences, this with its huge connotations of systemic farming and systemic animal slaughter, and then also the idea of social grace and social kindness and obedience, and all these big, and also, traversing, stereotypes, even in a way, you're just a pig, or you're a duck, or you're a horse, or whatever. No, it's all these huge moral issues. This film could be seen as our favorite, as you and I are, Babe, woke, but it delivers it so effectively. I have a little problem with the uncanny valley of talking animals in general, but, it is successful because it's so well crafted. It's so neatly edited and built and put in a way that is accessible, that, as you're right, it balances tone relatively neatly. So I think, yes, it really is a really effective way of telling moral stories. And I think we need a bit more of a better approach to it, so that films like Snow White, that people assume are telling moral stories in a very negative way to the greater public, which really aren't, are replaced with films like Flow, like Babe, that actually tell really nuanced and deep stories in a way that is effective because they are good films and they are solid and they have a bit for everyone. And I think this film does that really well. And so I'll just say, that'll do, Babe. That'll do.
Well, that brings us to the end of another episode of Cinema Spotlight. It's been so lovely chatting to you, Jake, and of course, having the company of you, dear viewer. And that just leaves us to wrap up with our film of the week. So, Jake, what would you recommend people pop out to the cinema to watch this week?
Well, I wish I could recommend them to go see Drop Dead, but it's not called that. It's just called Drop. It's a bit of fun. It's got a great title sequence. You might guess it. It's got a bit of action. It's not brilliant, but it's more interesting than everything else. So yeah, go see Drop. What about you, my dear friend and charming reviewer colleague?
Well, I think that my film of the week is Drop as well. Although I actually had a pretty fine time with The Amateur too. I think that for me, Drop is just, the sort of slick, stylish, and fun whodunit that I think everyone's sort of really craving at the moment. A lot of the things that we're seeing out right now are quite heavy, are quite bleak. I just think people want a bit of fun sometimes, and Drop really is that. However, I would also recommend that people go out and watch Babe, because it's such an interesting, really quite impressively timeless film that really impressed me. And as I say, I'm going to go and watch the sequel because it's really hooked me. So yes, go and see Drop, but also maybe go and see Babe.
Next week, we'll be talking about Sinners, Warfare, The Penguin Lessons, and how old is it? 20 years? Bloody hell. Oh, I'm old. I'm so old. I went to the cinema to see this bloody film. The Curse of the Were-Rabbit, 20th anniversary re-release.
See you then, Jake. Bye-bye.
Bye, babe. Just to clarify, I know he says, "That'll do, pig," but I'm saying that the film Babe will do. So don't at me in the comments. Or you can. Come at me.